enough about Izzy. I want to talk about you.
Fifth Amendment.
I mean, those were wonderful recollections. I didn't mean to overstate your friendship. My source was Myra McPherson, so she's not here to blame. So I can blame her, right? If I overstated it, which I didn't mean to do. So Victor, you know, you have had this long and distinguished career. I mean, when you started out, when you started out in journalism, what were your intentions? What did you expect? What was your goal? What did you think your life was going to be like as a journalist?
I didn't know, but I thought it's something I always knew I wanted to do. I worked on my high school newspaper. I co-edited the Swarthmore Phoenix when I was in Swarthmore. I was drafted in the Army at the tail end of the Korean War and was transferred from a medical company to the headquarters company because every company had a correspondent and you're supposed to file something every week. Most people didn't file. I filed from the medical company too much every week. So when the editor himself was retired, was sent back to the States, the officer who ran the paper, I was an enlisted man, asked me if I wanted to be the editor of the paper. So I became the editor of the 53rd INF for Infantry News and did what I could to make trouble for the Army in that capacity, and but operating within its rules. And so I always saw journalism as a way to make trouble. I hoped constructively, without having the limits of authority and the obligations that went with official jobs, and so that was my.
And what was your first job as a journalist, other than the one in the Army?
Well, my first job was I started freelancing when I came back to New York after the Army. I went to my first job, not in journalism, was writing speeches for Soapy Williams, who was the governor of Michigan. I came back to New York. He went to the State Department, offered me the chance to go, but I wanted to start my own little magazine, Monocle, which we called the Leisurely Quarterly of Political Satire. That meant we came out twice a year, and we had fun doing it. But in order to make a living, I had to freelance and write for other people. And it turned out that when you freelance, you have to find a place that you're comfortable writing for, that's comfortable with you, without you trying. And of all places, it turned out the New York Times Magazine was a home for me. So they kept giving me assignments. I would turn them in, and they would run them. And then they offered me a job as an editor. I took the job as the editor, but I had signed up to do this book on Robert Kennedy's attorney generalship, and so I worked for them for a couple of years. They wanted me to stay. They offered me a job as travel editor, which was not for me, although I like to travel, but I left to finish writing Kennedy Justice. And so that took me to Washington 2 or 3 times. Annie and I moved down there, and I got to see Izzy a little bit. So,
of the jobs that you've had, what have you learned? Can you look back and say what did you learn at the New York Times about yourself and the world, and your place as a journalist in the world?
Well, that's.
Do you remember?
I don't remember much of anything these days, 84 years old. But I see a bunch of old friends, and they've all taught me something. I learned how little I knew, and but as little as I knew, I thought I knew better than everyone else. Figured out how to put those two things together and survive, and by doing that. But I also thought I was not a particularly skillful person when I started freelancing and therefore had to over-research everything I did. So I did about 5 or 10 times as much research for every article as you ought to do as a freelancer,
Right.
given the pay scale and all that. And in the end, it turned out to be not a planned strategy, but a fact that made things work for me. So
And it worked for you because
it worked.
your work was more in depth. It
worked only because when you over-research, you at least get the facts right. There are no alternative facts to not get right. Now, it was a different era. I don't know how it would work today.
Yeah.
So.
You knew that you didn't want to be, quote, a mainstream journalist for the rest of your life? I mean, was that something you said you didn't want to work, be in an institution where they had all these rules and you had to go back, And had you thought about, I want to be an independent journalist, I want to be sort of, like The Nation magazine, where you really have the freedom to be able to not only write in-depth articles, but also the kind of commentary that The Nation does?
Well, I knew from my monocle years that I loved editing a magazine and having the freedom, and the people I recruited became lifelong friends, and they were partners. They told me what to do as much as I told them what to do. Marvin Kittman, Richard Lingaman. Marvin went on to be a television critic, and Richard was at the New York Times as an editor of the book review. And when I came to The Nation, I lured him in there. But it would be rewriting history to say I had a plan. I did not have a plan. What happened was that I did what you're not supposed to do as a journalist, and I stopped doing journalism and took a job in politics, which is against the creed of journalists, against Izzy's creed and other. It would be unthinkable for him to have been Soapy's speechwriter, and it would have been unthinkable for him to do what I did, which I became Ramsey Clark's campaign manager. When he ran for the Senate in New York, I called myself his campaign mismanager. He invited me to take the job because I subsequently I'd written an article about him when he was Attorney General, and I had interviewed him when I was writing about Robert Kennedy. He had worked in the Kennedy Justice Department. We had gotten to know each other a little, and he liked what I wrote about him, but I think really the reason that he invited me to be his campaign manager was he was way ahead of his time. This was in 1974. He was not going to take more than $100 from anybody. So he didn't have money to spend on advertising in a lavish way, and he knew that I knew reporters all over the world, which I did at that point. And so it was an inexpensive hire, and he knew that public relations would be an important part of the campaign. I guess I figured that out later on, and I'm glad I worked for him. He's a very special person, and I learned a lot. Again, how little I knew, because most campaign managers are always throwing their hands up because the candidate does not do what you know he ought to be doing or she ought to be doing. In Ramsey's case, he knew more than we did, so you could trust him and learn from him. So,
when you look back over you've seen a lot through your reporting. Your McCarthy era, writing the book about, sort of exposing the behind the scenes of that. When you kind of go through those political times, and then we're back to we're at the Trump era. I mean, how do you put the allegations of fake news? Nixon, after all, used to say, obviously he and Agnew, his vice president, hated journalists too. So, what's new about it?
Yeah. I think Trump is what's new about the situation. I don't think the news business and what he calls fake news is new. I don't think in most cases what he's calling fake news is fake, but I think his way of talking about it and the way the press has received him is different from how it used to be, although I made a bet more than a year in advance of the election that he would win the nomination, but I had never thought he would win the election. I thought he would win the nomination because he was the most famous of all of the
Right.
many people who were running. Everyone knew him from television, and he seemed to be a reasonably smart guy. I think the hope with him is that he doesn't believe anything. He wants to win, and therefore the two-state solution in the Middle East, which I think is the only possibility for peace there, has a chance because he doesn't care as long as, I think his willingness to work with the Russians against ISIS to me is a good thing. And so who knows what's going to happen. But as you ask these questions, you've made me think of something else when you asked earlier about my different experiences and what I learned doing it. I think you have to ask the questions which that you're not supposed to. And that Izzy's strength was, as I said, investigative reader, but he was asking himself the questions that no one else was asking. And in my own case, I remember when I was working at the Times, Abe Fortas had resigned from the Supreme Court because he had taken some money from somebody and it was revealed and he was in semi-disgrace and he was off the court and in private life at this time back practicing law and had given no interviews to anybody. And when I was at the Yale Law School, I studied with a professor named Fred Rodell. And Fred hired me as his assistant. And Fred was a great character. Fred wrote an article in 1936 in the Virginia Law Review called Farewell to Law Reviews, the first sentence of which, there are two things wrong with all legal writing. One is content, and two, it's style. And Fred took the vow at that point never to write another footnote. And he never did. And he was a good friend of Abe Fortas. And so the Times was looking for someone to interview Fortas. And I called Fred and I said, Fred, you're a friend of Fortas. Why don't you tell him that I'm an honest journalist and I would like to interview him. So Fred said he would do it. And he called back. He said, he'll give you the interview, but the ground rules are you're not allowed to talk about the past, what happened. That's not what it's about. It's about what he's doing now. I said, well, that's a story that they want, what he's doing now. And so I went to do the story about what he's doing now, and it turned out, that the story was in Washington. You don't not take a phone call from Abe Fortas. So he had become a powerful lawyer all over again. So I spent 2 or 3 days with him, including at his pool where his wife, who famously smoked cigars, took out a cigar famously and smoked it sitting around the swimming pool. And I got a good story out of it. But when we were saying goodbye at his door, I couldn't leave without. I said to him, he said, it's great to see you, Victor, blah, blah, blah. Anything else? I said, yeah. I said, why did you do it? And his eyes bulged. He looked at me, and then he said something. It doesn't matter what he said, but he said something that he hadn't said before quite that way. And that was the most important moment of the 3 days. So there's what I learned.
To ask the question.
Yes.
But be able to run away immediately in case they, is not happy, right?
Right.
Was he unhappy? Do you remember?
Say it again.
Was he unhappy that you had asked this question that he?
I don't know. We never talked again.
You probably would have known.
But I don't usually talk to people again after I write about them unless I know them. And so
do you think these times, people think these are just extraordinary times in the country and in journalism and, people can't, there are lots of questions about what might happen. There's a lot of fear. Journalists feel like they're under attack in Washington in particular. Is this the worst of times from your point of view?
It's not the worst of times, but I think we haven't talked at all about, and I am mostly ignorant about, is the new technology and the way in which, but the way in which it's affected everything, including journalism. And it has changed journalism. There are no more business models the way there used to be. Direct mail doesn't work the way it did. Mm-hmm. The ability to eavesdrop on other people has changed the way the Justice Department works. And journalism is supposed to keep up with all that and be ahead of all of that. And that is something entirely new. It's happening even as we're sitting here. And it's an exciting time to be a young journalist, I would think, because of that. And all of the Niemans out here, it's great. You're in a great situation. So,
on the other hand, as you said, the business models are collapsing.
There is no.
I mean, someone told me recently they don't think. I mean, they say there's a question about most of the major newspapers surviving, and so because of the financial situation that's changed so dramatically. So, I mean, it can be exciting, but who's going to pay for it?
Okay, my own view, Florence, is that every time a new medium comes along, the prediction is the old one is going to go out of business.
Right.
Movies were going to put radio out of business. Television was going to put movies out of business. They were all going to put newspapers out of business. They all have managed not to be put out of business. I have a prejudice. I'm a believer in the importance of print. I think that it is here to stay. But the forms through which it stays are going to change. And of course, the business models are going to change. They have changed, so.
I know you don't necessarily know for sure, but maybe they are going to change. But in the meantime, there are numerous institutions that aren't being covered, are not being well covered. I mean, it's pretty well documented that, there are not enough reporters who are employed and paid enough to live on and to be able to cover many of the agencies in Washington may have one reporter at most. Some of them have half a reporter.
The good thing is that since Trump hasn't filled 3/4 of the positions, there's no one there to cover. So they don't. But aside from that, there is something called citizen journalism. And again, right now it is rampant, and it's the reason for a lot of so-called irresponsible journalism. But I think there is hope that you can train citizens to be valuable contributors to journalism. It hasn't quite happened yet, but I think there are people in the audience that I can think of who will contribute to thinking about what the new business models are. Richard Parker, Sam Hayes among them. They have thought about this, and it's going to happen one way or another. I'm an optimist about those things.
Are you?
Yes, I am.
So in terms of the nation, how were you able to, I know you talked a little bit about how you were able to keep it afloat, but are you an optimist about the nation staying around too? For another 125 years?
Yes, I am, and I think there are a few things that I've done at the Nation as important as designating Katrina successor. She started as an intern, and a second thing that we did, Hamfish and I, when we got there, was we started the intern program, and it has given birth to, Katrina is only one of many. You see Chris Hayes, you see a whole bunch of people on television that got their start at the magazine, and so I think it has a long life ahead of itself as well as behind itself. By challenging the premises of conventional journalism, that's been its strength through the years. So,
what do you mean by that? Challenging the principles of conventional journalism?
Not going for the cheap headline story, but writing about long-term trends at a time when other people hadn't seen them, writing about, I mean, taking the labor movement seriously before other people did. So I don't take that as a personal contribution that I made. I think I had a lot of creative colleagues, dedicated, who could do things that I didn't and couldn't do, and the nation gave people a place to publish things that they couldn't publish elsewhere,
Right.
and that's an invaluable function, and so.
That happened to me. My story about Kathleen Willey and the
Right.
whole Clinton thing, and the fact that she was, documented that she was not telling the truth,
Right,
and no one else wanted to publish that.
here we are.
There you were. Yeah, you guys were
Right.
willing to do that, and it possibly kept Ken Starr from being able to indict Clinton for lying under oath, which was the intention. It's complicated, but that was the point of
Right,
keeping Kathleen Willey credible.
yes,
So I'm grateful to the nation for that, but you're right, that no one else wanted that story. They thought it had been done, right?
yes,
Many times. How many times have I been told that story's been done?
absolutely.
What's your advice to, I know you've talked a little bit about this, but your advice to mid-career journalists, which is what most of the Niemans are younger journalists, which some of them are today.
I don't have prepackaged advice of the sort that you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to look at it case by case, but my own experience has been, don't ever let people tell you you can't do it. That everyone has something to contribute, and you got to figure out what it is that you have and how best to do it. In my own case, you did your thing on Kenneth Starr. I and my colleague Richard Lingeman ended up writing a play called Starr's Last Tape. It was something we couldn't do in print in the magazine. We didn't have the information, but it showed Starr sitting in prison dictating his memoir. So it was a way of casting light on something that we thought was happening. There are many different knotholes through which to see what's going on.
Right.
But young people have a capacity today to do things that we didn't because of all of the new technology. They know things we didn't know. They were brought up with it, and they're at home with it, and they know a kind of research that you can make happen that we couldn't. We heard earlier of a kind of old-fashioned muckraking project. That's great, but the new technology undoubtedly made it possible in many ways.
So I know that there are many people here that you know, and as you said, who have experience, and who probably would like to ask you some questions while they have the opportunity here.
People I know won't want to ask me questions.
Okay.
They know
Well,
how
never
little I
mind. Let's have the people who don't know you. So is there anyone who would like to? Yes.
Victor, as someone who has spent a lot of
You
time...
mean probably, if you could stand up just so people can hear you better.
Well, I'm wondering, as someone who has spent a lot of time as a professor at Columbia Journalism School, if you'd talk a little bit about the role of journalism schools in the future. And when everybody's going to go out and write their own blogs, is the journalism school still going to have a role, or more of a role, or less?
Yeah, he's wondering about the role of journalism schools. What do you think the role of journalism schools should be today, and do they have a role? An important role, a significant role.
I think journalism schools can be great. I think the Columbia Journalism School is a very valuable institution. I think the problem at Columbia, from my point of view, is that what you have to teach can't be fit into the single year that students can afford. So they can't afford to stay more than a year, but there's more for them to learn than they can learn in a year. So how do you deal with that? especially those who want to do documentary films and have a documentary as a thesis. You can't do the documentary in the time span of the J School the way it is currently set up. But again, the J schools have to throw out their old curricula and keep revising and reinventing themselves, and I think the best of them do. So, I don't know.
Yes.
Do you teach? Have you taught at a J school, and do you have?
I went to Columbia J School, so I was curious.
And what's your thought about it? So.
Well, I don't know, but I'm thinking of all the people who just can go out and write their own blogs these days without any reference to a journalism school. I'm wondering whether J schools will survive that kind of environment.
Well, the blog is an art form, so let's see what happens to them.
Here's a question right here.
Not a question. Victor, tell them the story of what you learned in Burke Marshall's attic.
How do you know I was in Burke Marshall's attic? So, Burke Marshall was Robert Kennedy's assistant attorney general for civil rights. And he was he came out of an antitrust background. He was the world's most civil and honorable, one of the world's more honorable people, and extremely smart. After the Justice Department, he was there during the height of the civil rights movement, and the Kennedy administration had to be educated on what the civil rights movement was all about, and I learned about the process by which the process by which that happened. But what Burke told me when I went to interview him was that his papers were in his attic, and I was welcome to look at them, but they didn't put anything on paper in the Kennedy Justice Department. They did it all by word of mouth so that I wouldn't find anything. I spent the next year flying down from Washington, where Annie and I had moved with our however many children we had at that point. We had one child to start. How many did we have when we moved down that year? Anyway, but every weekend I would fly into New York and go and drive up to Burke Marshall's home in Bedford Hills and go up to his attic, and then we'd come down and have dinner afterwards and go over what I had read. And I learned how to think about the law and the relationship of the law to the civil rights movement in a way that I hadn't before. And he was someone who by natural temperament was conservative and yet contributed to a radicalization of the government's role vis-a-vis the civil rights movement. And so.
You're leaving out the most interesting
That's
part.
what
that
I was
again?
thinking.
You're leaving out the most interesting part.
Good, okay, well, tell me.
Come on, you've told me.
Well,
Well, give him
About
a
ML
The
King?
snowstorm.
you tell me. So I'll leave out the most interesting part.
What did you learn when he went off on vacation when you were in the attic? Remember that?
What did I learn?
You found.
Maybe you
How to take papers
should
out.
offer it.
You found the
No,
I found,
you found an enclosed envelope and you opened it.
I
A
found
sealed
it.
envelope that you opened.
yes.
You don't remember it?
Well, no, I do remember. Again, 84 years old, don't remember a lot of things. But I do remember finding a sealed envelope, and lucky for me, he had gone on vacation in the Caribbean, and so he wasn't there to ask whether or not I could open the sealed envelope. So I had to open it in his absence. And in it was a transcript of conversations he had had, whether it was with the governor of whatever state it was in the South. There were exact transcripts of the conversation. They were trying to integrate the state, and I learned that, and I asked him about it. He said, "How do you know that?" And I said, "Well, it was in your files." He said, "It was." I said, "It was. They happened to be sealed, but they're in your files, and you told me I could go through them." And I learned that you should unseal sealed envelopes when you're going through someone's files.
Well, I was under the impression that this is how you scooped and learned that the FBI had taped MLK. Is that wrong?
Say it again?
It was how you learned that the FBI had taped Martin Luther King. And then you had a scoop.
Yes.
Is that wrong?
I'm thinking about whether that's how I learned that the FBI, I mean, the FBI taped everybody that they could in those days, and they do it more now than they did then. But it's not wrong that I got that at that point, so thank you for reminding me. What else did I tell you?
It's sealed.
Well, the first surfacing of that was in
Did you
Kennedy
send it? Would you mind
Justice.
just so he can hear you?
The first surfacing of that was in Kennedy Justice.
Right.
So it made it into your book, huh?
Right, it made it into Kennedy
And was
Justice.
it
and a lot
breaking
of other
news
things.
or something that was being picked up all over? I mean, that was a pretty, if that was your scoop, that was a pretty big scoop,
Yes, yes,
very big scoop. I mean, we know that they were taping everybody, but
yes.
someone had to reveal that they were taping him.
There's a writer named Richard Margolick who is about to embark on a project of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And we have a date to talk next week. Now you've reminded me what I should talk to him about.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Christian Feld. I'm a current. My name is-
Since you don't have a microphone, it
Yeah,
can be
yeah, I
more
will try.
difficult to
Yeah,
hear.
yeah. My name is Christian Feld. I'm a current fellow from Germany, and you mentioned how digital technology changes our profession. I was just wondering, to what extent do you engage with digital technology?
I had an old-fashioned tape machine. And I would tape a lot of my interviewees. But when I was working on the book that became Naming Names, I remember going to interview the great screenwriter, Albert Maltz. And Albert Maltz was a very Talmudic man, and he had written This Gun for Hire and a lot of movies that were very well known in the 40s and 30s. And I said to him, Mr. Maltz, I hope you don't mind if I tape you while we're talking. He said, oh no, this is too important. I'm taping as well. So he taped me taping him. We sat there, we had this conversation, and then I went back to my hotel in Hollywood afterwards, and I turned on my tape recorder. It didn't work, so I was in the embarrassing position of having to go to my source and ask him to give me the tape of my tape of his tape. But here's what he told me at that interview. That was, to me, quite extraordinary. That he was someone who went to prison, as did the other members of the Hollywood 10, because they wouldn't answer the questions of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And at the time they were called in 1947, it was not generally known that you could escape that by taking the Fifth Amendment. And they thought they hadn't done anything illegal or improper, so they took the First Amendment, and that was insufficient to keep them out of prison. And many years later, so they all went to prison for terms of from 6 months to a year, and the Hollywood 10 were sort of lumped in one image for people who were not part of it. One of them, after he got out, became an so-called informer and named names when he got out of prison. The most famous of the 10 were Dalton Trumbo, who was a great screenwriter, a very funny man. And what Maltz said to me after we established that we would tape each other, Trumbo was famous at that point because he had made a speech after he won something called the Laurel Award. And what he said in that speech, he said, those of you who are too young to remember the Hollywood blacklist should study it because it's a very important part of our history. But when you study it, don't look for heroes and victims because there weren't any. There were only victims. And that was received as a healing, wise, generous statement. When I walked into Albert Moltz's house, his statement to me was to attack Dalton Trumbo. He said, it takes away the meaning of our lives to say that what did we go to prison for if there were no victims and there were only no heroes? And he couldn't accept, he couldn't abide this thing. So it was, the taping was an important part of the experience, but his message was an important part of that experience. And they never resolved the difference between them, but after the book came out, he came to a reading. It became a subject of major concern and still is. Now the blacklist is still studied by many people. And how to respond to a period like that is something that you can learn from studying that. So,
Well, I would like to just make a couple of concluding remarks, Victor.
good.
Which is
Great. Well, I'm very grateful to you for all.
to thank you for what you've done for journalism. You know, you've kept alive an important magazine that's always been pushing against the powers that be. You've helped bring up a number of writers and editors and cartoonists. Calvin Trillin was, there's a whole history of really remarkable people who have come through the nation. And the nation is still alive after
Very much.
125 years plus, right? And that sends a signal, I think, or it gives us hope, I think,
Right.
that this kind of reporting, that you can be independent, that you can push against the power structure, and that,
you can subscribe to it.
and you can be successful. So thank you. And I think all the young people here especially I hope you were inspired by knowing that there are people like Victor who fought for these kinds of things for all of his career, and that enables us and all of you to be able also to have hope that, one foot in front of the other, right? Nose to the grindstone, and it works out. So thank you again.
Thank you. Great.